Hi, you're watching Cooking with Diane. I'm Diane, and in today's video, I'm going to show you how to sharpen your knife. Now, in my other videos, I talk a lot about how you should be chopping most things with an 8-inch chef's knife, and that it's going to be a lot easier for you if that knife is sharp. But how do you get your knife to be sharp, and how do you know your knife is sharp? These are questions that I hear a lot, and there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of gadgets out there. I'm going to show you a couple really simple, basic ways to sharpen your knife at home. So how do you know your knife is dull? I could show you some tests to do, like try cutting through a piece of paper or try chopping through a scallion. But in all honesty, you probably know when your knife is dull. If you're trying to chop through things and your knife is just mashing them into the board instead of slicing through them, or if your shoulder is super sore after chopping for a while because you have to push so hard to get it through the vegetables, then your knife is probably dull, and sharpening it will make it a lot easier for you. You can also think about this in terms of the amount of time that you've had your knife and have been using it regularly. When did you get your knives? Did you get them last year? 2 years ago? 5 years ago? 20 years ago? Have you ever sharpened them? If the answer is no, I've never sharpened my knives in 20 years, then you gotta sharpen them. No knife is magically sharp forever. For a home cook that's using their knife 30 to 60 minutes a day, I'd say sharpen your knives once or twice a year and you'll be in good shape. So that's enough talk about knives. Let's start talking about tools. A lot of you might have something like this in your knife block. For those of you who don't know what this is called a steel. It is not actually there to sharpen your knife, it is there to hone your knife. What a steel does is align the metal fibers along the blade of your knife so that they're straight. If you're mashing your knife against a cutting board while you're chopping, all of these metal fibers at the bottom of the knife start to splay out. And so it's not going to cut as cleanly because it's not a straight edge. This has a magnet running through it, so by running your knife along the steel, you bring those splayed out metal fibers back into a point. It won't literally move the metal on your knife, so it's not going to sharpen the blade, but it is going to align everything so that it will feel a little bit sharper after you hone it. So to use a steel, if you've never used one before, what you want to do is run your knife from the base of the knife to the tip of the knife, from the base of the steel to the tip of the steel. And if you're super new to this, I recommend holding it like this so it's upright and so the counter is holding some of the weight of the steel so you don't have to worry about juggling two things at once. You also want to think about angle here. So my knife isn't flat against the steel and it's not at a wide angle. You want the angle between knife and steel to be about 22 degrees. Did you forget about angles between now and 4th grade? Go ahead and Google angles and what 22 degrees means. The angle between the steel and the blade should be about 22 degrees. So this is a 90-degree angle, right? Half of 90 degrees would be a 45-degree angle, and half of 45 degrees would be about 22 degrees. So that's the angle you want to hold your knife at. And then we're going to just run it along the steel from the base all the way to the tip. So we're covering all of the steel, but also all of the blade of the knife. And anything you do on one side, you want to do on the other side. You can use the steel every day. It will keep your knife nice and straight. But it won't sharpen your knife when it needs sharpening. So just 10 to 20 times on each side works for this. And if you start feeling good about this, you can start getting faster. Then maybe one day you'll pick up the steel and sharpen away from yourself. Make sure you're not doing this around other people, of course. It can also be helpful to feel what your blade feels like. if you feel comfortable with touching your knife blade. Obviously, never run your finger along the blade. That's a mistake. But you can kind of twang it like a guitar string and see, does it feel crisp or does it feel kind of like a butter knife? That's a good way of telling if your knife is sharp or not. And if you continually feel it, you'll be able to feel the difference between when it's sharp and when it needs sharpening. So once your knife has been honed by the steel, but it still needs to be sharpened because maybe you tried cutting an onion and you just kind of smushed the onion into the board instead of cutting through it, then it's time to sharpen your knife. Now, normally, I advise home cooks to take their knives to a kitchen supply store, most of which will sharpen your knife for you for $5 to $10 per knife. If you're only sharpening your knives once a year, this is a really good thing to do. It'll save you the time and trouble of having to do it yourself. Plus, they're experts. They really, really know how to sharpen a knife well. However, if for some reason all of your local kitchen supply stores are closed and you're stuck at home, then you might need to be sharpening your knives at home. So there are a couple of tools that will help you do this. I recommend not investing in one of those electric sharpeners. I just don't think they're worth the money. They're not going to do a better job than you do. And although sharpening your own knife is going to take a little bit more practice, you'll have a lot more control over how it works. So the super basic thing that you could buy is one of these. This is like a kind of cheater sharpener. I got this at the grocery store for like $20. It has two little lines that you put your knife into, and inside the line there's like a stone, a whetstone that's already set at that 22-degree angle that you can just run your knife through. And depending on how dull your knife is, you might need to do this 50 times or 100 times, or if it just needs a little refresher, maybe just like 10 times. There's usually 2 or 3 lines on one of these sharpeners, and they are numbered. So mine say 1 and 2. That means that you want to run your knife through the number 1 slot first and the number 2 slot second, because these are 2 different grades of stone, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So if I'm in a hurry, I'll use this thing and run my knife through it however many times I need to. And just like with the steel, I go from the base of the knife to the tip of my knife. And I really push it into the machine. And as many times I go through number 1, I need to go through number 2 that same many times. So if you've never ever sharpened a knife before and you really don't want to be bothered with it, this could help you at least get it somewhat sharp. The downside of these is that you don't really control the angle that well, and the stone will wear out inside them after a while. Now, the old school way to sharpen your knife, and the way that I do it, and most chefs do it, is with a whetstone. So these are also available from kitchen supply companies and online for usually about $40. They come in different grains, and true to the name, whetstone, you want to keep it in water for about 20 minutes before you're going to use it, because if you try rubbing your knife against a stone when it's super dry, you might start a fire. So you want to keep it lubricated either with water, or you can also use oil on top of it. I know some people that do that. So first I want to put my stone on a towel. The towel will both help anchor it so it's not moving around while I'm using it, and it'll keep it from scratching my countertop. And I always put the stone horizontally in front of me, so the long way is facing me. So my stone has 2 colors. I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but it has like a reddish brick color on top and a white color at the bottom. These 2 different colors are 2 different grains of stone, and they're numbered. You can see on the side, this red part is 400 grit, and the white part is 1,000 grit. The smaller the number, the larger or coarser the grit of the stone. And so the duller your knife is, you want to use a smaller number grit. That coarser, more gritty stone is going to move the metal of your knife a little bit more effectively. And the finer grit is for kind of finessing your blade after the bulk of the sharpening has been done. So you always want to start with a lower number. I start with the 400 and then I'll go to the 1,000. So when you're sharpening along your stone, you also want to use that 22-degree angle between your knife and the stone. You can always start with 90 degrees, do half of that, 45 degrees, half of that is 22 degrees. So I'm holding my knife almost flat along the stone, but I'm still holding it up at an angle. And just like with the steel, I want to start with the base of my knife all the way at one end of the stone. And I'm going to drag the entire blade of the knife along the entire stone so that I end with the tip of my knife at the opposite end of the stone. So let me show you a close-up of how to do this, just so you can see the angle a little better. So you see I'm going from the base of the blade to the tip of the blade along the entire stone, holding it at a 22-degree angle the whole time. So when you're using a stone as opposed to a steel, what the stone does is it actually pushes the metal of your knife. Sometimes it even erodes some of the metal, so you don't actually want to over sharpen your knife or you'll start eroding it. So in order to effectively move the metal with the stone, you really want to push it down into the stone. I'm using a lot of strength from my forearms and fingers to do this. I'm not just kind of gently swiping it along the stone. That's not going to do anything. You really need to push it in. How many times do you do this? Again, it depends on how dull your knife is. If your knife is really dull, start with 100 times per side. And I know that sounds like a lot, but you might even need to do more after that to get your knife back to factory conditions. But start with, choose a number, start with that, then try your knife out, and if it feels better, maybe you're good for a little while. Also, sometimes I get tired of counting, and so I'll set a timer instead. So I'll say, okay, I'm going to do each side for 2 minutes. And that way the timer takes care of the counting and I can listen to music or a podcast. Now remember, anytime you do one side on the knife, you need to flip it over and do the other side. And this side might feel a little awkward because you're doing it with the opposite hands. There are certain knives, especially Japanese knives, that request that you only sharpen them on one side or that you sharpen them at a 10-degree angle instead of a 22-degree angle. If your knife came with any directions like that, or if you're just not sure and you don't want to mess it up, you can always contact your knife's manufacturer and see what angle they recommend that you sharpen your knife. Most chef's knives that American households will have at home, you can sharpen at a 22-degree angle on both sides. After you finish sharpening your knife, you can use the steel to hone it again. And you also want to wash your knife because you've probably got some mud on it from the stone. So the way that I just showed you, not everyone sharpens their knife like that. I've seen a lot of chefs sharpen their knives with the stone facing vertically towards them. And they sharpen it like this, starting with one section of the knife. They move it forward and back in kind of a rocking motion. So it would look like this, still holding the knife at a 22-degree angle, but instead of going side to side, they're going back and forth along the blade. And then once you're done with that section, 50, 100 times, you move to the next section. So I don't like this method because I have to sharpen 3 times as many times because I'm going section by section instead of doing the whole blade in one stroke. But a lot of people argue that this will develop kind of little teeth on the blade and therefore make it sharper and grip onto your food better. So if that's really something you want to try, go ahead and give it a try. But I prefer this method. I just think it gives me a more even sharpness all along the blade, and it just ends up taking less time. And if you try this method, you also need to be wary that you're not grinding your stone so that it's uneven. I actually did it with the side of my stone, and I don't know if you can tell, but there's kind of like this U shape in my stone now. It's not straight. So I actually can't do this on the white part of my stone because the stone's not straight anymore. So that's another reason I prefer this method to this method, is because it keeps my stone more even. So now that you've sharpened your knife, you've honed your knife, you've washed your knife, it's all nice and sharp and clean and ready to sail through vegetables, let's talk about some ways to make sure you keep it sharp for longer. First of all, when you're finished using your knife, don't put it in the dishwasher. The water in the dishwasher is super hot and it comes out super fast and it will dull your knife. Not just the water, but the fact that your knife would be banging around in the dishwasher against maybe other metal utensils. That's just going to dull your knife fast. So always hand wash your knife. No, don't leave it in the sink to hand wash later. That's a recipe for disaster. Instead, just wash it carefully with soap and water, dry it, and put it away right when you're done using it. Don't keep your knife in a drawer, just in a pile with all of your other utensils, because then it's just going to bang around with next to all that metal every time you open and close the drawer. So if you don't have an official knife block or knife holder or magnetic knife strip or whatever, you can keep your knife in a drawer, but make sure you put it in one of these sheaths. You can get these plastic knife sheaths for like $3 each. You just slip it on your knife, and now you can throw your knife wherever you want, and you can also travel more safely with it too. Just make sure your knife is totally dry before you sheath it, because putting something wet into a closed space will breed bacteria. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video will help you keep your knife sharp. As we say in the culinary world, a sharp knife is a safe knife because it will cut through your vegetable instead of slipping and cutting you in the hand. So try this out. Thanks again and have a great day.